Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your hosts. This time, multiple hosts this week. Buddy Sotelo, Mike Leno, and all the way up from Canada, Jonathan Schwartz. So,
good day.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And we had a guest, but we'll have to rebook him in a couple weeks.
All right, well, Russ, let me plug his book because we do owe him that. We've had him on before about a year ago. Mike Rogers has put out. He's the preeminent Pacific Northwest historian since probably about mid '70s. He's put out 4 books now. Katie Bar the Door: The History of Portland Wrestling, which is absolutely amazing, and now the third. And he's corrected. It's not going to be the final. It was to be the final volume of the 3. Excitement in the Air. His name is Mike Rogers. That's spelled a little differently, Rodgers. So there's a D in there before the G. This is volume 3, The Voices of Northwest Wrestling. And I think that's grappler Len Denton, of course, Tough Tony Bourne, Haru Sasaki, and Mean Mike Masters on the cover. There are some really incredible, and there's quite a few Canadian athletes.
Yeah, the grappler is one of my favorite all-time wrestlers. I love Len Denton, so I had a lot of Len Denton questions to ask him, but
we will.
Felt late.
He's got some shots here of him against Jimmy Snuka, and Len Denton was one of the. He was kind of like the Eddie Gilbert of the Northwest in terms.
Yeah, is he still around?
Yeah. He came to Cauliflower Alley.
Okay.
He comes quite a bit with. Quite a crew from up there who also worked in Roy Shire's territory, because one of the people Mike put out the great Ring Around the Northwest newsletter from about 1981 until, for over 30 some odd years, I think even 35. So he was one of the longest newsletter writers, like Evan was with Wrestling Then and Now, and Meltzer with The Observer. But the interviews that he had in the newsletter, and he's got some brand new ones, but they're really lengthy, in-depth, the kind of stuff, the minutia of a person's career. And I'm going to read some of the, just the names. I'm not going to go into a lot of it, but he starts with the grappler Len Denton, who was amazing. He wrestled all over the world, had some Japan tours.
I mostly remember him from World Class.
Yeah, world class, but he was also in Florida. He was in Georgia Championship Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic.
Jerry Rhodes. Not to interrupt, but just one thing, since you mentioned world class, Russ.
Yes.
At one point during the 1980s, there was actually a pretty strong talent exchange agreement between Don Owen and Fritz von Erichs. There was actually a lot of bleed between those two territories for a while. That's how you get guys like Billy Jack Haynes,
Rip Rogers,
Chris Adams, Rip Rogers, like a lot of those guys kind of going back and forth at that point.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right, because Frank Dusek from World Class came into the Portland territory, and Frank Dusek is on a lot of those Dark Side of the Rings. He's interviewed the Bollywood Boys, so he's going. Mike Rogers is going to all the indie shows. The Bollywood Boys, late of WWE. And they've been working. Jonathan, where did they go after WWE? They were like home based. I know they did some NXT, but when they left, where did they go?
So they've been all over. I've seen them on Impact when I was in. So a few months ago, I went to see AEW when they came into town, and they were booked for that as well in the dark matches. I think they actually were in a match that aired on Dark. They fought the Butcher and the Blade and got killed, but it was a very good match. But mostly they're based out in Vancouver. So there's still a scene up there, but they wind up working a lot of indies along the West Coast, primarily Northwest. There's still a bit of a scene up there as well, and definitely down the coast as well, from what I understand. And hopefully they catch on somewhere soon, because they're great.
Oh, they are. They're terrific.
I think that's one more case where I know Jinder Mahal's now another good Canadian boy, is now working with Inta Share. So the two really big guys, Veer Mahan and Sangha, I think his name?
Yeah, Sangha.
Sangha. But honestly, from an entertainment and just a working perspective, I think it's a bit of a trade down. No offense to Veer Mahan.
But Mike Rogers was also pretty sure seen Darby Allin, and Mike was very close to Buddy Wayne before he passed, but his son Nick is all the rage. He's like a 17-year-old kid. He's already had one, if not more, Japan tours, wrestled in Europe, and has a signed deal as soon as he turns, I guess, 18. But he's signed with AEW. So I don't know if it's like a developmental thing, but it's very impressive. He was on Chris Jericho's podcast for a good hour. And so Mike Rogers is lucky enough to see that. And he's got one of the top promotions there that Darby Allin, I guess, helps out with. But Chris Daniels and a wealth of talent have come into that one. It's sort of like the revitalized new San Francisco promotion that came in the wake of, when APW couldn't promote. Russ, what's the name of that group? Is it the South? They're in South San Francisco, and they've got all this New Japan and AEW talent coming in and out.
Was that West Coast Wrestling?
Yeah, West Coast Wrestling. Have you been able, we know that AEW is coming in March. Do they have three? They've got the pay-per-view, but do they have two separate and distinct Wednesday and Friday shows in San Francisco at the Chase Center?
One.
Just the one on Wednesday.
To which I was going to ask you, Jonathan, how much were tickets for your AEW show?
A lot.
Well, okay. I'm wondering if they challenge what they're charging in San Francisco.
Well, didn't they say, at least for TV, they start probably the nosebleed at 25, but then they go up there.
Ours were a lot more than that.
That won't get you parking at Chase Center. $25 won't even.
That's a brand new, arena that lured the Golden State Warriors.
Dude, I checked, and the cheapest seat for the worst seats in the arena are $75. That's
probably
worst.
Consistent about with what they were there. Our seats were a little bit better than that, and gotta tell you, for it being a TV taping, and admittedly my frame of reference is several years out from the last time I went to anything taped, but they were not inexpensive, especially for
how much for floor? How much for floor seats?
Floor, I don't know. Ours were roughly $150.
They're charging $750 for floor.
We weren't floor though. We were like first balcony for where we were.
Ringside.
You're talking about TV or the pay-per-view?
It's for. Well, there's only one show, so I don't know whether it's.
No, there's television, and I think that's what you're talking about, the Dynamite and Rampage taping all on a Wednesday. So live Dynamite, and then the taped Rampage to follow, possibly a Dark or Elevation. But then, since everybody seems to shift to the Saturday pay-per-view is what, well, that would be the thing I'd want to go to see,
Well, let's see. March 5th is what? March 5th is it's the Sunday show, and there's only one show that they're selling tickets to, and that's the Sunday show. And floor seats are $750.
That's
and
the
ringside are $1,300.
The pay-per-view does. I'm not agreeing with it, but I'm aware that the pay-per-views are going to be far more costly than the TV. So the TV Wednesday would be less expensive if
that's not in San Francisco.
Oh, it's not
going to be in San Francisco.
Only
the one in San Francisco is going to be. The worst seats are $75. For probably where you were sitting would be about $300, Jonathan. That's what they're charging for first row upper level.
Well, I would go for the 75 just to experience and feel what it's like in comparison.
No, man, if you can't get me a press pass, I'm not going. That's just the way it is. I'm not. And then the park at Chase Center is like $50 also.
I'm plugging this book because it's available everywhere, and I'll find out.
He'll be on the show, and he can plug it also. So
I want to plug it. We owe it to him. Excitement in the air.
It's good. I'm glad that you are, but he'll have a whole hour to talk about it. So I'm not too worried about that.
If you love and want to learn more about Don Owen and everything that was going on, he was one of the last guys like Jerry Jarrett. That brings me into just very quickly the losses. I'm not going to go into anything, but let's just dedicate the show to all the folks we lost. I mean, just today, in the last couple of days, entertainment-wise, Raquel Welch and Richard Belzer, who had that involvement with Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, I remember that. I was thinking about that. We should talk about that for a sec when you get done remembering.
I'm pretty sure I brought him to Legends. It might be 20, 22 years ago, but Belzer first saw him with Chevy Chase in a movie called The Groove Tube that came out and was impetus for Chevy Chase getting on the news desk thing at the Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, it was sort of the predecessor. It was the follow-up to Kentucky Fried Movie.
Yeah, but that thing came out in like 73, SNL in 75, and that's the first place any of us saw Richard Belzer, but also with Chevy Chase. It was an insane movie. I think you had to do drugs to watch it, but listen to this.
I think there was enough going on behind the scenes there.
Yes, thank you.
Now,
yeah, you get a contact high just from renting the movie.
Jonathan, being from wonderful Ontario, where my wife and I, we honeymooned in Montreal.
And you're from Toronto.
And right? Then we took a train to Toronto. We took the glass-covered top ceiling to Toronto and had a fabulous time in Toronto. But I was going to say, amongst all the people we lost Jerry Jarrett last week. I think we did the tribute to him.
No, we didn't last week because
all right,
Mike, I love you, but your memory is really falling apart here.
Here's
we weren't on the show last week,
Russell.
So we didn't talk about Jerry Jarrett.
And I also just want to mention, if we fail,
he's still alive.
Jerry Jarrett is not alive.
No, but he was 2 weeks ago when you would have been on the show. So
you're interrupting Johnny Powers, who was an incredible legend in the Ohio. He ran Ohio and upstate New York with Pedro Martinez in the 70s, the NWF territory. And Jonathan, I think you might have been on the show where I said he sold when the promotion started going downhill after they did the 3-ring circus show, which we can get into, where they had matches going on in 3 different rings at the same time, with totally incredible talent. Johnny Powers on top against Johnny Valentine in the main. But Powers sold those titles when the promotion went south to Inoki and New Japan. And it was insane because he had never teamed with Pat Patterson ever, yet when they came into LA, they had all this bullshit that our lead promoter, Mike LaBelle, said, there's this global tournament. It's ending at the Olympic Auditorium in LA, and Johnny Powers and Pat Patterson are going to defend the NWF World Tag Team Championships against Inoki and Sakaguchi. Well, both Powers and Pat told me at the time, and then later on when I put them together and interviewed them at a Cauliflower Alley in 2000, when we moved from LA to Vegas, that they had never teamed before, never really met or any of that stuff. Now, of course, after they dropped the straps at the Olympic in 75, August of 1975, to Inoki and Sakaguchi, and, that laid the groundwork for the IWGP title, because Powers then finally toured for New Japan, and Pat had his very first tour. But this was after they dropped the tag titles. So 2 guys that have never teamed before, never had the straps on them, are defending, it's like a phantom title change, but it's happening in real time. They drop it, and then after that, Powers would go on to drop the NWF World Strap to Inoki, and that was blended in when they said everybody had to hand in their belts in New Japan. So it sort of was a initial formation because they had no singles title for New Japan until the NWF came in. But that was Johnny Powers, who owned a ton of property and lived in Ontario. So Jonathan, what do you recall? Because I got to meet the guy at the Eddie Einhorn shows, and then when he came into LA. So I have a lot to say, but he's like an Ontario guy, and that's where he retired and passed.
So he is, but if you want to read more about it, Greg Oliver over at slamwrestling.net actually did a really comprehensive obituary on him, and I would very strongly recommend it. I think one of the weird things is, though, that by the time I became a wrestling fan, he'd pretty much retired. And he was one of those guys who I think retired before the convention circuit really became a thing. And really, apart from keeping in touch with a few friends from the business, he'd mostly disappeared. So he had a number of business concerns, he had a family, and he just kind of went off quietly and had this whole life outside of wrestling. Later on, he was asked about it, and he said, well, after I stopped really looking like a wrestler, I didn't really want people to see me after when the image that they had in their heads was going to be, Hulk Hogan before Hulk Hogan, basically. I mean, if you saw him when he was in his prime, he was
a good-looking guy, looked like
and a muscle man, and the whole kind of thing.
But he was wearing well, whatever we want to call it, a hair thing, and his thing in the back, some of the boys who wore, hair replacement things, whatever. But he was famous. Even Vampiro Firpo and some other guys told me, he said he would tell like green guys or jobbers or people new to the area, not the hair, don't touch the hair. And he did the same routine. So you were not to touch or grab his hair because it might come off. But he was, I'll try to, next week, I'll try to hold up some photos I took of him. Tremendously good looking guy. And do you recall reading about that 3-ring circus? He put on this amazing all day and all night show. There was a women's tournament, a little persons, but then called midget tournament with all the top stars, Sky Lolo, Little Beaver, Little Brutus, Little Bruiser, Haiti Kid, tons of them. Tag team tournament, which was supposed to put together for the first and only time Wahoo McDaniel and Chief Jay Strongbow, who was not Native American. He was, of course, Italian-American Joe Scarpa. I think Strongbow didn't show, but Wahoo did, which was unusual because he came out of Mid-Atlantic for that thing and was not part of that territory. So it was going to be very unique. But in the upper tier main events, when all the tournaments were over, they had like Ernie Ladd against Waldo Von Erich. I might be screwing these matches up. Bobo was on one of the, and then I think it was the main event was Johnny Powers defending the NWF World Title in '73 against Johnny Valentine, which was an ass-kicking match. Or it was, for that time, it was 4.5 to 5 stars if you want to go the star route. But Johnny Powers was one of those good-looking, early before Rock and Roll Express, etc., or the Von Erichs, that the women would throw themselves at. It was drawing a younger female demo that had not really come to wrestling. And we saw that in some areas, particularly Florida, with Jack Briscoe, Jack and Jerry, good-looking young guys in the 70s, and Powers from, say 1969, 1970 through 75, that's when the territory started crapping out, 74, 75. He did some double turn with Ox Baker, and I think that was the beginning of the end. But they had a weird dynamic, and I'll shut up, with Sheik, in that Sheik would send them talent, but he and Johnny Powers and Pedro could not get along at all. Sheik and Joyce Farhad, and sometimes Sheik felt that Powers and Pedro Martinez were infringing on what he felt were his Ohio territory. So Sheik sort of tugged on the noose, from what I've been told, in Ohio, but of course they had Powers and Martinez had free reign up in upstate New York, particularly Buffalo, and they were drawing well. Pedro Martinez had a rep for stiffing the boys at times, etc. We heard that from a lot of promoters. My own Mike LaBelle, main guy, but Johnny Powers deserves respect. He had it was called the Power Lock, right, Jonathan? It was his version of the Figure 4. But of note was, and I'm done with this, Eddie Einhorn, when he challenged not just Munchnick and the NWA, but also Vince Sr. and the Tri-WF, he wanted to get into New York badly. He couldn't get Madison Square Garden. He did eventually get the Beacon Theater, famous Beacon Theater where all those rock acts had performed. But he got those 3 Roosevelt Stadium shows that I shot and worked for Eddie Einhorn, who was the co-owner of the Chicago White Sox. But at the very first show, jammed with talent, Johnny Powers came in with Inoki and Lou Thez together, and they came into the dressing room just to see what the hell was going on. Sheik was allegedly there. I did not see him. I didn't see Sam Munchnick, who was allegedly there. I mean, just the guy's running with Pedro Martinez as his booker, as well as George Crybaby Cannon and Al Costello, Kangaroo Al Costello. But Powers was at that thing. I have my shots I'll bring on next show, of Inoki with Thez and Johnny Powers all standing in the back. And then Powers wrestled on the second Roosevelt Stadium, New Jersey outdoor show, and which was Thez also wrestled there. But I also took some pictures of Powers with Ricky Starr. That was like the only public appearance anybody had seen of him since like the early to mid 60s. And here it was 1975 in New Jersey, and Powers is standing there with Thez talking to Ricky Starr, who definitely Thez said he hadn't seen Ricky Starr in ages. So Johnny Powers, very important. He went to...
Mike, didn't you say you were going to shut up for a second and let Jonathan talk? because that's about 5 minutes ago.
Okay, well,
Please,
I've
Jonathan, say
saying,
something.
I'm just
Let
saying,
me know you're still alive. You haven't fallen asleep.
I'm still here.
Good. So you've got an
Okay.
opinion on something. Go ahead and give it.
No, I was just going to say the other thing about him was that for the time he was very innovative, and he was also, I think, even more rare the more you kind of hear about how the territories worked. He was a pretty astute businessman. I mean, he bought his way into more than a few territories over the years, and actually, when he was running the promotion with Pedro Martinez, that was for the time, it was a pretty sophisticated operation. They had a TV show which had pretty good coverage across the US and I believe into Canada as well. And he was smart. He marketed it with himself, again, being part owner of the promotion, as Championship Wrestling with Johnny Powers. And I think it's interesting that you go from this approach where you're kind of booking yourself as the main attraction. I mean, Vern Gagne did the same thing with the AWA until well past his sell-by date. But then you look at how it works today, where really post Hulk Hogan, one of the things WWE learned from that experience was to market the promotion, not the talent, so that if the talent winds up not available or injured or just decamp someplace else, you've still got a show to go on. And people aren't necessarily depending on plunking their $75 in the cheap seats to go see a specific wrestler. So interesting kind of shift in booking philosophy over the years. But again, for the time, Powers was a very smart and astute guy. And again, he's another one of those wrestlers who was able to get out and have a pretty fulfilling life outside of the business as well, which is something, frankly, I always like to see.
Good.
That's my hot take.
We this week yesterday they were showing the A&E documentary of Randy Macho Man Savage, and they brought on they have a significant number of minutes where they interviewed Lanny Poffo, and you weren't on the show after Lanny passed away, so I wanted to get your thoughts on Lanny Poffo from you.
I was actually.
Oh, you know what? That's right. You were, yeah.
With Pampero for your post.
Yeah, we had Furpo's daughter on there, but yeah. It was kind of some.
I say I made an impression.
Yes, but they were. It was kind of weird to. I guess maybe they're showing it again because of his death. They want people to see Lanny Poffo's one of his, not his last interview, but was one of his probably biggest profile interviews, last big profile interviews that he had. And it was kind of sad to see him there and just think about, having him on the show. And, it's good to see that they're remembering him, at least A&E is, by showing the Randy Savage A&E documentary. I don't know if you've seen it.
2 years old, Russ. It's 2 years old.
What actually struck me in the wake of the last 2 weeks and the number of people who've passed away, it strikes me as interesting how a lot of the things that those wrestlers laid down still continue to this day. One thing that I found really that I always look forward to when I'm watching AEW is if you've ever watched the Acclaim on their way to the ring, the Max Caster's raps. And they certainly push the envelope a lot more, but you can draw a direct line between the Genius talking smack went through poetry back in the early 1990s and what Max Caster's doing today.
Sure.
And I always think that there's these. I actually wrote my last column about it. I think it bears noting that there's a lot of this where current acts tend to be homages or to borrow from what worked in the past. And I think that,
and if you haven't seen it, it's new to you.
Exactly.
So even though that's what we used to say in the business, we'd say, let's do this routine that we saw from, the early 80s, some wrestling routine or some angle that had been worked in the early 80s, because we said crowd's probably not seen it, so it's going to be new to them.
So I've actually got a question for you guys, if you don't mind. I want to workshop something for a piece that I'm thinking about writing, but I don't know if I'm out to lunch on this one, if that's okay by you guys.
Yeah, sure. I don't mind doing your work for you.
So all wrestling is theft. So the thing that I'm thinking is I don't know if you've been watching SmackDown and following the whole bloodline angle with Sami Zayn and the role that he's been playing.
Oh yeah.
I could be wrong, but I think leading up to last night's Elimination Chamber pay-per-view, I think Zayne is playing a version of the same character that got that really rose Mick Foley to prominence. It's that same kind of off-kilter, weird charisma where he's getting over, but he's not doing by threatening. He's not doing by outright beating people up, even though he's certainly capable of that. It's this weird dynamic that he has with one of those world-beating characters. I think you could draw a parallel between Sami Zayn and Rock and Sock era Mick Foley, and Roman Reigns playing almost the Rock kind of character, where he's more that kind of superhero. And if you take it a step further, I wonder if Kevin Owens then becomes Stone Cold Steve Austin.
But Jonathan, can you hear me right now? Do you remember?
Yeah, I can.
When Sami first, he seemed very heelish when he was he was looking for anything to, I guess, prop up. This is the character Sami Zayn, not Sami Zayn the person, of course. But he was like sleazing his way in and ass-kissing his way into the bloodline because nothing was working for him. He'd lost whatever the strap was on SmackDown, and you know.
Same way, so if I can draw a parallel, same way you had Mick Foley as for dropping the Mankind mask and wearing a suit and tie and begging for admission to the corporation with Vince McMahon.
So yeah, I forgot that. So no,
I'm kind of feeling like, in some ways, he's sort of like when John Moxley, or when he was Dean Ambrose. I think there's kind of that I get the kind of Dean Ambrose vibe. Maybe I'm forgetting a little bit of going all the way back to Mick Foley, but I'm feeling he's kind of
Ambrose,
got that everyman.
So Ambrose, when he was Ambrose, always struck me more as a combination of Roddy, like that kind of Roddy Piper manic charisma, with a little bit of Stone Cold Steve Austin. I don't give a you know what.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Russ, I just sent you Johnny Powers in his prime photo. I don't know if you're able to pop it up. Great, but back to Sami. So Jonathan, though, but you recall when he was doing that, and it looked like he was grasping and trying to get in there and say whatever it took, and then I think most of the fans or the people buying into the storyline was, hey, he's in there, and now he's trying to be, say, a valuable member. So the heel thing, he was morphing from like a slimy heel trying to work his way into the bloodline to being a productive member for whatever you can be when you're not related to those guys. And then it went a little over the top with the dancing and the weird handshakes and, saying the Uzi stuff and whatnot. So it's very unique, but I mean, I see exactly your Mick Foley parallelisms, but he certainly had his own tweaks to the character, who was ever growing because of the genius of Paul Heyman's writing.
And the thing is, I mean, Heyman also, pre-WWE, Heyman was also involved in developing Mick Foley's character. When Foley finished in WCW, he wound up, I think he was even champion there. And I know he held the tag belts with Mikey Whipwreck a couple of times. But a good part of how Heyman rehabilitated Mick Foley 30 years ago was basically have him cast aside the hardcore antics that made him so beloved by fans initially, and he would go to the ring and basically just tie somebody up in a hammerlock like Ole Anderson for however long. So it was, I think you guys said it best. A lot of ideas wind up getting reused and spun. I feel like the bloodline generally is one of the things that makes it work is it's basically the corporation by way of Goodfellas.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that if you look at Sami Zayn coming in as an outsider, so to speak, into that faction, that's basically the whole plot line of Goodfellas, where you have Robert De Niro's character and Ray Liotta's character who aren't eligible to become full-blown gangsters because they've got Irish blood and they're not full-blooded Italians, with apologies to another ACW stable. See, Tommy Rich. But I think that it just kind of adds a different layer to it. But I think if you look at it, the characters, the way that Sami Zayn, as you guys said, worked to ingratiate himself with the bloodline, the fact that you took a comparatively serious performer who, at least in character, had experienced a number of setbacks and really wasn't being taken seriously despite wanting to, and he recasts himself in this way and builds a groundswell of support that I don't think we've seen really since Daniel Bryan.
No, he's exactly.
Maybe Kofi Kingston had the same kind of mojo to him, but I don't think. And again, I could be, well, I'll cop to my bias here. He's a Montreal boy too, so I'm. There was. I don't know how they managed to get out of Montreal with Sami Zayn not winning the title, and there was not a riot. And they built that.
You're exactly right. Yeah, Jonathan, you're exactly right. He has elements of the Yes movement with Daniel Bryan and Kofi Mania, that sort of underdog. But yes, Montreal and Canada loves him, but I think the rest of their audience globally also loves Sami, maybe not quite with that fervor, because, particularly when he speaks French and he's in Quebec, they go rightfully nuts, which is, amazing. So where do you think do you agree though? I think the bloodline is the most interesting. I can't even think of a more ever growing. Each week the thing is growing, and an overall storyline than the bloodline. I can't even recall it. It's been many, many, many years. Even though some of the funky stuff WWE has done, I think this is the best stuff they've done in many decades. But what are your thoughts on that? And where do you see bloodline going, now and past WrestleMania itself? It's got to continue past WrestleMania. There'll be some, whatever happens there if Roman does indeed drop to Cody.
So I'm not convinced Roman drops to Cody. I'm not convinced, and I like Cody, and I've loved his work to date. I think that if it hadn't been for his getting injured so quickly into his run initially, he would be perfectly primed to beat Roman Reigns. But for me, anyway, something about it just doesn't click. And I think for me, it's that Cody's a great performer, and he wants to be loved like his dad was. He's a great wrestler and a great interview and a wonderful talker, and he's a natural heel. And he fights it every step of the way. And I think sooner or later, and I think a lot of wrestlers are, I think it's the same thing that happened with Roman Reigns. Before he found the tribal chief persona, they tried ramming him down people's throats as a generic, charismatic, babyface, world-beating superhero kind of character. And audiences just rejected it. And it wasn't until he turned bad. I think that what really needs to happen with Reigns ultimately, I think they've kind of booked themselves into a corner with him, but I have him keep it against Cody. Personally, just for the sake of fun, I would have him eclipse Pedro Morales' title reign. And then what you need is an even bigger bad to take the belt off him and turn him face. I think the crowd's already been in that process for a while now, and things like this feud with Sami Zayn are kind of keeping him heel, but it's going to take more and more work. If you watch when he comes out to the ring with the Usos and they do the hand gesture where they, raise their forefinger to the sky, you've got about half the audience that's doing it already. When he opens promos with a demand that the audience acknowledge him, they are. You don't do that for a heel. So I think that the upshot of the bloodline is somehow or another you introduce a new real monster heel. At one point that would have been Brock Lesnar, but Lesnar's kind of past that point in his career, I think. And that's what turns him good, and that's what kind of propels him to the next stage in his career. I think Cody, I don't know if either of you are comic book fans or have ever watched the Amazon series The Boys.
Oh my God, do I love The
Cody
Boys.
is Homelander.
Ha! That's
is-
funny.
he
He's
is-
a little bit more likable than Homelander. A little bit. Come on.
Well,
Homelander's a Nazi.
Only. No, that was Stormfront. but Homelander kind of plays to the kind of, if superheroes actually existed and had no moral compass, which a number of them probably wouldn't, it plays to that. And Cody just looks that part. And with the fancy robes and the bleach blonde hair, and I know Dusty did that too.
Well, who comes out as a wrestler with suits on every time he comes out to do a promo?
As a good guy.
As a good guy, nobody. I mean, I can think of Lou Thez or Flair.
But Thez wasn't really.
What I'm saying, when he sent promos, this was in the late 70s when they would send, when he was already champion, or early 80s, they would send the promos to Kansas City or Portland or Toronto of Flair coming in, and he was just wearing a suit. But I mean, Cody is unique because he almost caused me to gag a little. Why isn't he just coming out like a regular guy? Maybe he purposely, because Dusty was such a jeans and torn T-shirts and whatnot, that he's trying to be the diametric opposite, at least sartorial or clothing-wise.
But it goes beyond that. I mean, Cody, and I fully appreciate wanting to establish, to differentiate himself from his dad. I mean, Dustin got pegged with that very early in his career when he first started, and he was wearing the same tights and the same Western-style boots and trying to cut the same vaguely wheezing promos that Dusty would back then. And audiences didn't like that either because they still had the real thing. But when you look at Cody, it's his persona. He's slick. He's a trained actor. He incorporates a very comprehensive vocabulary when he's declamating.
He's linguistically gifted. He comes across very college-bred, smart, as opposed to Dusty. And then there's the nickname.
And audiences hate that.
Yeah.
And also, I think that horrible neck tattoo.
Bockwinkel.
That horrible neck tattoo, I don't think helps.
That was an accident. He's actually given interviews about that. It was supposed to be about half the size and like hideable underneath one's collar.
Why did he get that? Do you know the story? Because it just appeared. He came on AEW with it, and I was groaning when I saw that.
It's horrible.
So there's two parts to it that I've heard. Actually three. The first one is that originally it was supposed to be a lot smarter, and he was kind of mortified when he found out that it was as pronounced as it was.
Don't you see that when it's being like drawn on at first?
I don't have any yet, so I couldn't speak to that. The second part.
Tattoos.
The second part is that it's his personal brand. So he decided to do this as a way of succeeding outside of, at the time, was pretty much a one company system. So it was literally him putting his neck on the line. And I've got to say, understanding it like that, it's not necessarily a look that I would embrace myself. I don't think my corporate office would be that thrilled if I walked in, like that. But I can certainly understand why he would do it. And the most important thing, I think, when it comes to tattoos is that it was something that is meaningful to him.
Yeah, that's his brand. When they show the graphic, the 3D, whatever it's called, the graphic that they can do on both of their shows, the Monday, Friday show with, it looks real, but it's not, it's just animation in there. Let me ask, and this can involve Russ, and cut in if I don't mean to change it, but I just want to say, between Dustin's interview the other night, which was out of this world, and then a couple of weeks ago, and Russ and I and you, Jonathan, didn't get to talk about one of the best in-ring semi-shoot for bit promos I've seen in many, many, many years, and that was Cody with Heyman. Why don't you guys talk about that? And hopefully Russ saw both, because Dustin was amazing, that interview he gave the other night, if you know what I'm talking about, Jonathan. And then the one from 2 weeks ago on Raw that was, blew that out of the water. And that was his brother, Cody, with Heyman, with some real shoot stuff going down. And do you think, Jonathan, that was laid out in the back, or did Cody bring up some stuff that was not discussed in advance with Heyman? You know, that you saw Heyman tear up a bit and it was taken aback?
I have to tell you, I honestly don't know, and the fact that I honestly don't know is what made it so good. I think for people like us who've spent our whole lives watching this, and 95% of what's on screen, we can probably tell exactly what's going to happen beats before it actually does, if not months before when it comes to some storylines. The fact that you can still have moments like that where you're like, you just take a step back and you're not entirely sure whether something is real or not. I think that's how you know, that's kind of what we all watch for. That's when pro wrestling really works.
I mean,
I think it was a work.
Yeah,
I still think that it was all scripted because just they picked two of the best.
If it was really well acted.
But they picked two of the best talkers to do that. You know, they wouldn't just pick, Mark Henry or something like that.
But it was all true. Tommy Dreamer said it was all true. He was there when Heyman threw Dusty a bone in whatever year it was, when Dusty needed some money in 2000, and it was true hard times. So there was legit shoot aspects of it, which made it so damn good. I mean, I taped and saved it, and I've watched it 3-4 times now. Russ, did you get a chance to see it, though?
Yeah, but as I said, my impression of it was that they just got two of the best guys that they knew would be able to deliver it well, because those are two of the best talkers that the WWE has at the moment.
So part of me would like to think that it was ad-libbed, if only because if it was, the way Heyman, for Rhodes' part of that promo, he very nearly turned Paul Heyman good.
Exactly.
And for Heyman and it took him a while to get there, but for him to come all the way around back to that ending, which reestablished him as a dastardly heel, brilliant.
Yeah, that's
and I know he learned from guys like the Grand Wizard and Blassie and Albano and the many before him, but I don't think even those guys could have come around with that.
They never.
I thought that was brilliant.
And Napolitano and I shot him. We posed him with those three, the triumvirate managers, the Wiz, Ernie Roth, Blassie, and Albano. But he was just like everybody else. He was a young kid, young teen, watching them. But they never did anything like that. Nothing. I can't think of any manager, not even the Sheik's Eddie Creechman, who did flips.
Because managers, for the most part, were still comedy relief. I mean, there were a couple of managers who weren't, but by and large, they were still kind of treated as like a way to have an alternative, distraction to the seriousness, what was going on in the ring.
And in fairness, Eddie Creechman was an absolutely despicable stereotype. He was, for being so. He worked in Montreal extensively. He actually wound up buying it towards the very tail end of the promotion. And he worked as the lead heel manager along with his son, Pretty Boy Floyd Creechman. And again, early memories, my dad watching him, my mom being aware of the TV being on in the other room with Eddie Creechman, and he would come out, and the important thing about Eddie Creechman in Montreal is Quebec, in some measure, has long had a bit of an identity issue when it comes to people who are not French Canadian. By no means everybody, but certainly within Canada, there's a sense that they're not necessarily the most welcoming culture. So if you set yourself up as something different, and the kind of character that Creechman played and the kind of stereotype that he played to would have been nuclear heat there, and he dove right in it. Heyman does that sometimes as well. There was one promo that he cut when he was managing Brock Lesnar, and Lesnar was going up against Goldberg after Goldberg had come back, and Heyman gets in the ring and says the Mourner's Kaddish over Bill Goldberg. Mourner's Kaddish, if you're Jewish, is basically a prayer that you say for 11 months following the death of a loved one, basically to help guide them into the afterlife. it is not something that should be fodder for a wrestling promo. At least most people wouldn't think so. Same kind of deal, but 1,000 times worse and 1,000 times more broad when it came to Creechman. There was no redeeming factors to Creechman's performance.
I'm just
He
saying
was great at it and entertaining at it, but
Creechman,
different thing.
70s when Grand Wizard left in 73 to go to Vince Sr. and go from Abdullah Farouk, which was offensive, certainly now, just the name, the Grand Wizard, that would not fly today, because
you know that he took the name the Grand Wizard to take the piss out of the Ku Klux Klan.
Did he? Yeah. I met him many times. He gave John Arisi and I a ride from, I think, New York to Boston for a WFIA convention. So we were with him, and couldn't have been a nicer, sweeter guy. But I'm thinking of Detroit Creechman when he had to come in and take over for Ernie as Abdullah Farouk and manage Sheik from pretty much that period on, 73, 74, through the feuding and the end of the Bruiser battle, with Bruiser coming over to battle Sheik 3 times. But I was thinking Albano, back to what we're saying, somebody like Heyman. There's nobody can touch Heyman, but Albano, particularly when he Piper hit him with the framed, whatever that was at the award thing, hit him over the head.
Yeah, for the rock and roll, the war to settle the score.
It was Cyndi Lauper's platinum record.
Was able to elicit some nice, even though he was out of his mind, insane, and had some alcohol issues and stuff, to be honest, knowing him. But Lou did. He did sort of have that magic in being able to. How many managers did you know, other than maybe Sir Oliver Humperdinck, that could go face heel and elicit emotion? I'm just saying, but nobody can touch Heyman, who has probably studied many, many other managers, not just those, but probably everybody on the planet, the Homer Odells, all of the J.C. Dykes, Gentleman Saul Wengeroff. There's another one that maybe Jonathan could speak to, but the guy that did the most offensive in terms of a Jewish stereotype was somebody in the ICW, Izzy Slapowitz. Jonathan, did you ever see his work, or maybe Russ?
I'm not as familiar with him.
Well,
I know the name, and I've heard that it doesn't come across well, but
yeah, it's before my time.
Yeah, he wore at times yarmulkes, and that would be like at some points a loaded gimmick, and Star of David's and other things. You just should not, like with other people, maybe not discuss politics, maybe not bring sensitive religious things. It
was like when Baron von Raschke used to come to the ring in a Nazi flag.
Oh God! But there was a zillion post-war in the 50s, 60s.
Yeah,
lots of.
There were Nazis into the early 80s.
Yeah, lots of Nazis going back to like 47. Kurt von Pappenheim, there were millions of them. Salt-throwing Japanese, how offensive is that? A sneaky Japanese wrestler, or
Pearl Harbor job.
All of them. I mean, the Sheik's character too. He was Armenian. He wasn't from Syria. Is there?
I thought he was Lebanese. Firpo was Armenian.
Lebanese. You're right.
But yeah, it's what was okay if 20, 30 years ago, absolutely not okay now. You wouldn't be able to get away with that now. And Heyman knows that. He knows what he can get away with, and he's a master. I still think he worked that interview, but there's nobody in the profession who could work it the way that Heyman was able to do it.
Russ, has he bothered you at all when, like calling, for example, Sammy, what did he call him? John Shlomo?
That I didn't hear.
He called him that a couple times.
They did have an interesting exchange towards the end of Sami Zayn's run, where it was basically in the fall, a little bit earlier, where Heyman asked if Sami had a good Hanukkah, and Sami Zayn answered by saying about as good as Paul Heyman's Ramadan. So I think they do both play it pretty close to the line. I tend to think Heyman's kind of crossed it a couple of times, but he's just so good at it that you're kind of willing to overlook the things that
you look at how much heat Cornette got, when he was announcing for the NWA a couple of years ago, and he got fired because of his comments.
Well, he basically told he basically told an Ethiopian famine joke in 2023.
Right.
Leaving aside the fact that that's about 40 years out of date.
Correct.
But I think that Cornette's got his own podcast. Let him talk.
He does. Hey,
I'm not taking him on.
I wanted to find out if either of you guys have seen the Bison Smith documentary yet.
Not yet. I do want to because, of course, I knew him as well. I just haven't had the time. I should really make the time and see.
Yeah, what are you waiting for? You're in it, Mike.
How am I in it? The guy didn't even contact me for photos.
Watch it and you'll see. You're in the back. You're actually in there during a couple matches in the garage. They have you wandering around in the background. You'll see yourself in it. So I know you can never resist you being part of something. So
I would have liked to. The photos, Russ, you haven't even seen. They're pretty stunning of him all over the place. Plus, when Misawa brought in the 3-4 Noah guys, where was that show? You know, the big one. Misawa?
That was in Vallejo. Oh wait, no, that was in Fairfield. That was the one show we did in Fairfield.
That was pretty amazing, and just the level of talent, and then the shots of him at APW Misawa when he came. And I think I even have a shot at Dilip with, Dilip Singh, the great Kali, with Bison. A lot of events. And
Jonathan, have you seen it yet?
I have not.
Okay.
I have the link.
Yes.
I'll
Some
put it
partners
there.
You guys are. My big claim to fame, and you won't even watch me in
I'm not in it.
Screen debut.
If I'm in it, I've got a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah, well, no, you're not in it, but Mike is, and he needs to watch it just to see where he's at, so that I know that when I know that I'm in a film, the first thing I want to do is go see it.
Well,
but I actually have a pretty decent role.
Mark Smith was such a nice, good to the core guy. That's the reason to see it, and a tremendous athlete secondarily. And Mark would be in the whole scheme of AEW, New Japan, perhaps now, had he, not passed, which is very troubling still for me.
I will say I'm glad that the film got made. Just for myself, I remember watching him early on in Ring of Honor. He had a number of appearances along with Eric Stevens and Brent Albright. And there's just kind of a core of guys who came in around the same time. I think it was when they got their first national TV contract, and you started seeing all of these new faces there. And he went on to All Japan, and you didn't have the same kind of access as you do now. And the next thing you know, he'd passed away. And until I spoke with Russ about him many, many years later, he was always one of those guys who first you wonder why he didn't make it to WWE. Again, the only game in town at that point. And because he was a big guy and he passed away quite young, without knowing any better, there's a tendency to see him following the same kind of narrative that so many people like, young, really well-built, big guys just kind of unfortunately drop dead. And there seems to be a pattern to this. And I think that there's a
lot of parallels between him and Gary Albright. I think there's a lot of parallels between the kind of life that he led.
And neither case is good, but I think that there's also a difference between, say, him and Gary Albright and, say, Test.
Well, Test made it. I mean, he made it into the WWE. He was a pretty major star.
But he passed away at 30 from a drug overdose, unfortunately.
Nowhere athletically on the level of Mark Smith or
no. But you're right. That Mark's situation was not self-induced, nor was Gary Albright's. It was just hard.
Well, Gary consumed a lot of alcohol. I was around him quite a bit. He would contact me, send me results from Japan when he went over the one time to Europe, etc. Got him to come to Cauliflower Alley. He engorged on food and alcohol, whereas Bison, Mark Smith.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
About his body. He was, his body was his temple. Gary, I'm not faulting Gary because he's a wonderful person, really wonderful guy as well, like Bison was. Gary, just loved Gary to death, but he did, indulge. I mean, certainly a lot of us eat and drink too much, maybe, not to those levels, but I got to pull out the shots of Gary then if you guys want to see him. And Russ, are you able, before we go, are you able to pop up that picture of Johnny Powers in his prime?
Oh, yeah. Hold on a sec. Let me go pull that up. I did get it.
Gary Albright had married into the NOI family, hadn't he?
Yes, yeah. I think it was Sika's daughter that he'd married to. And so he was beloved by the Anawahe family. I'm sorry that's a little bit small, but that's Johnny Powers, kind of a poor man's Jack Briscoe physically, but the women loved him in his territory, wherever he wrestled. They loved him in Japan. Had the long hair. He was doing the power lock, basically the Buddy Rogers leg lock or the Jack Briscoe figure four. So I just want to dedicate the show to Jerry Jarrett, who was just total legend, one of the greatest storytellers ever. The guy Vince would have relied to had he gone to jail and the steroid alleged trafficking mess. That was Vince's successor, or the guy that he handpicked to try to run if he had to go up, go to whatever you want to call it, go away for a while. Jerry Jarrett, because Vince had that much respect for him. So I think that says quite a bit.
So, Jonathan, can you tell us about your latest article and what you got coming up?
So my last one actually came out Super Bowl Sunday, so I can imagine that everybody was focused solely on that to the exclusion of all else. I basically looked at the idea. Basically, this one came out of our show about Lenny Poffo, and looking at how gimmicks tend to be reused and honored and taken as homages, and kind of the difference between taking an old gimmick and making it your own. My jumping off point was really the Judgment Day stable, where you have Damian Priest copying some of Scott Hall's Razor Ramon mannerisms. You have Rhea Ripley playing a new version of China. You have Dominic Mysterio really leaning into who his real dad is, Eddie Guerrero, in the course of the characters that they're playing. And the differences between acts like that, where you're basically bringing you're looking at specific characters kind of going from one person to the next. You're looking at tropes like the Genius to Damien Sandow, or the Innumerable Russians, or Nazis.
I did the same thing with Mark and his Super Destroyer character. I mean, I basically did the same thing.
Sergeant Slaughter had that once upon a time.
Yeah, but again, when he was the Super Destroyer character, he almost never did a promo. He always just looked big and menacing and just didn't say much on the mic. If he had talked a lot, everyone would have known it was Sergeant Slaughter. There's only so much he can do to disguise his voice. But for me and Mark, that was one of the great parts, is that, he was just supposed to be big and menacing and not talk. And then nobody knew that it was Mark Smith, or a lot of people didn't know it was Mark Smith. Now, of course, he had a tattoo on his shoulder of the drama mask, the Greek drama mask. So people did figure it out that it was Mark, people would be, busting him.
Although in fairness, right now in the NWA, there's a team that is kind of recycling the old Doom gimmick under the mask. So two big black wrestlers who just lay waste to their opponents. And one of them is Red Dog.
I didn't know that.
And you can tell because he's got tattoos up around his chest and all down his arms, and he's wrestling under a mask with the whatever degree of anonymity that's supposed to. I think that they should recycle that gimmick, and they should give it to Omos and Aziz.
Oh, we finally got Mike right back on, unfrozen, or he's been frozen for the last. We have a major feedback.
Now he's joining us from space.
I don't know if you can see this. I was just trying to get back on. Listen.
I don't know what's going on with your audio, but we got too much reverb from you. You're coming in. We can see you video-wise, but you must have your computer on at the same time. So it's just us for now. Mike's got my. I don't know what's going on with Mike there, but
I was so hoping we could go full ground control to Major Tom with that.
Yeah, I agree. So, if we got Mike, okay, Mike, are you in normally here?
Yep. Yeah. I'm sorry about that.
Now your audio is fine. So we're just about at the hour here. So let's wrap everything up. What's your next article going to be on, if we can get a preview of it?
So I've got a couple in the hopper. The next one, I think I'm going to look at the whole Sami Zayn thing, just kind of coming out of Elimination Chamber and what that means for WrestleMania, and really, where do you find an opponent for Roman Reigns, especially since Logan Paul seems to be occupied with Seth Rollins now, who would be a convincing heel, or do you need the big bad to come in and effectively turn Reigns into the face that we always knew that he could be? The other one is I want to take a look at wrestling fathers and sons. And I think that might be a big one. I think I kind of planned that one out a little while ago, but with Jerry Jarrett's passing, Lenny Poffo's passing, it seems like there's a lot of families that I grew up watching where we're either heading to the next generation, and in some cases there just isn't one.
Yeah.
And what does that mean going from certainly if it's something that's been a mainstay of wrestling since the television years?
Well, I can only say for my own behalf, my father never watched any wrestling with my brother and myself. He never saw me perform, never went to a show, never watched any wrestling with us, was totally embarrassed by my brother and myself love of wrestling. And it wasn't until later on that I found out that my great-great-grandmother was a huge wrestling fan and used to go to all the matches in San Francisco and used to hit the wrestlers, the bad guys, with her purse as they would come down to ringside. And a lot of the wrestlers knew who she was. My Granny Gelnay was.
Thankfully, the women in my family have more sense than that.
You're talking about father-son wrestlers like Yvonne Robert Sr. and Jr., right?
Sure, or the Rhodes, obviously.
Let me make sure everybody looks up Excitement in the Air Volume 3. Get Volumes 1 and 2. Also, Katie Bar the Door. If you want to learn about Pacific Northwest Wrestling, the author, Mike Rogers, Rodgers. But, Jonathan, are you talking about father-sons just watching wrestling, or father-son like Dory Jr. and Terry and Dory Sr. type father-son?
No, I'm looking at the real deal. I think it's and it runs the gamut from families that kind of start off as fake and become something real as new generations are brought into the act. You can look at families that start off as actual, father, son, brothers, and then you kind of extend the brand. I've already drafted the part where I look at Fritz von Erich, and as his world kind of collapses, he starts bringing in Lance von Erich as a random cousin, which was about as successful as Oliver on the Brady Bunch.
Talked about that a lot too.
And everything from the Poffos to the Harts to, I mentioned, the Von Erichs, and the interesting part where the family relationships aren't acknowledged.
The Johnsons.
Well, Baby Doll is the daughter of two wrestlers, a male and female. Mm-hmm. And then there's a huge family that's all tied up there with her.
Tully Blanchard, Magnum TA is kind of drawn into that.
DiBiase, had his son wrestle.
He was adopted. He wasn't biological. He wasn't biologically related to both the father and mother. A lot of people forget Iron Mike DiBiase's wife was also a female wrestler of quite.
So I thought Ted DiBiase was actually Helen Hill's son, but he was Mike DiBiase's stepson.
Maybe, yeah, that's probably correct.
That was my understanding.
Stasiak was another one, Stasiak and
it's interesting how there doesn't seem to be any correlation between, other than possibly being a lower bar to getting into the business, between how well one generation's going to do versus another.
David Bruno Sammartino didn't quite cut the mustard.
Well, David Flair's one of the, Nick Goulas' son.
George Goulas was the one I was going to mention.
Greg Gagne is another guy that just
Greg
quite fit the
Greg
business.
Was acceptable. Nobody could be the amateur collegiate hooker shooter that Verne was.
He was terrible in the ring. I hated Greg Gagne in the ring, and he was only getting over because his dad ran the promotion. Everyone knew that. He couldn't make it on his own without.
He appeared in other places, but whatever. He had Japan tours that didn't have anything to do with Verne. He certainly wasn't Verne, we'll put it that way. And he was not the strong person in the partnership with Jim Brunzell. Jimmy Brunzell was, much better athlete.
I agree.
Well, Jay Strongbow's son actually wrestled, but only ever made it as a low-level enhancement talent.
Right.
And there was no acknowledgement that they were father and son.
I think he was actually, that was a work. It was Joe Palumbo's son, who was Jay Strongbow Jr. Joe Palumbo was like a journurman wrestler. Look that one up.
Jay Strongbow actually had a legitimate son who, well, I presume legitimate, who wrestled and actually had a few matches in the WWF at the time, but he wrestled under a completely different name, did not appropriate he wasn't the Rebel Joe Scarpa Jr., he wasn't Chief Jay Strongbow Jr., anything like that. He was just a guy.
What about sons who eclipsed their father? Ricky Romero was a pretty good journeyman wrestler to maybe be mid-level, above mid-level, but at least one of his three sons eclipsed him, and you didn't always see that. Obviously, I mean, Angelo Papa was a great wrestler, but Randy surpassed.
Yeah, it's much bigger legend. Hey guys, we're done for the week, so come back in a couple of weeks, Jonathan. We can talk all about the sons.
Piece. I'd like to see Jonathan tackle sons who did better, or even daughters who did better than their father or their mother who were wrestlers.
Carmella.
Yep.
Her dad was apparently an enhancement guy.
All right, guys. Thanks so much for doing the show. Jonathan, great to see you. Mike, hopefully you'll get your camera fixed one of these days. He's already out of here. So we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for being on the show. Good night, everybody.
Good night.